Well, Isaac, good morning. Seems like we were just together. Oh, wait, we were just together. We had a wonderful week celebrating Thanksgiving together in Minnesota. I'm back in North Carolina. I've got one of my traditional white coffee mugs here. I have to break on some Christmas Noel mugs here soon. But how are you this morning?
I'm doing well. You'll notice I've got a different background. This is actually the other side of the room that I'm normally in
Right.
because you just left this room.
That's right.
My office transitions into the guest bedroom, so haven't got the desk put back to where it normally is. So you're seeing the other half of my room today. But good to be with you virtually.
Exactly.
We were just together for 7 straight days.
That's right. And enjoyed every one of them. So this Christmas, as we get into the Christmas Advent season, as I was thinking about Christmas, last year I had read a really good book by Dr. David Jeremiah, which was a devotional book on Christmas called Why the Nativity. And he looked at 25 why questions surrounding the birth of Jesus. And it kind of inspired me to think of developing a series of messages this Christmas around some of those ideas. And when you think of the question, why, it's interesting to realize that on Google gets a lot of why questions. You know, we used to go to the encyclopedia or we used to go here and there, but now when we want to know the answer to any question, we Google it. Google has become a verb. And so what do you suppose might be the 50 most common why questions on Google? You can actually look that up. And if you do, the very first one is, why is there a leap day? So probably that one comes around towards the end of February, once every 4 years.
There's a lot of people asking once every 4 years if it stays at the top of the list.
Must be, yeah. And then the second, which is a deeper question, is why is the sky blue? And then someone is asking Google, why are you always lying? So they obviously don't trust the answers they get. And then a common question, why should we hire you? People are looking to understand how to answer that question.
How do we answer that question? Yeah. Like Google knows why you are hireable.
Yes, exactly. And then a classic question, which I actually have never asked before, is why are cats afraid of cucumbers?
Didn't know that they are.
If you ever
Unless
need
Google's
to repel
lying
a cat, yeah.
Maybe
Unless
why is Google lying to us?
Yeah, exactly. Apparently, let's see what it says here. Cats are simply scared of any object unexpectedly placed behind them. To cucumbers, another answer, cucumbers resemble snakes and trigger an inherent flight reflex.
So they're scared of whatever gets placed behind them, and cucumbers are naturally sneaky. I don't know who's placing cucumbers behind cats.
Google, why are you lying to me? I think I have to ask that question here. So those are some interesting why questions from the rest of the world. But rather than Google the why question, I think we should Bible the why question. And the number one why question of Christmas is, why did God become a man? I think we can get the answers of that from John chapter 1. Let me just read the first 18 verses, called the prologue to the Gospel of John, which tells us, I think, the answers to why did God become a man. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known." So those verses, I think, begin to help us see what God was up to when he became a man. But when you think of that, why did God become a man? And you look at that passage of scripture, what comes to mind for you?
Well, I had a different answer for you. But then what you just read, I think it's summed up in those last 5 words. He has made him known. And I think, if you look at the beginning of time when God created man, they knew God, right?
Yes.
And very quickly, they chose themselves over God. And then there was a lot of history of man living on this earth really without a connection to God. And that, as John calls out here in chapter 1, part of why Jesus came was so that we could know God. And my original answer was, we just did a communion episode a couple weeks ago, right? And then we also, in our house group a couple weeks ago, did communion in our house group. And our host family had just put up their Christmas tree like that day or recently. And so we did communion kind of standing around, and the Christmas tree was kind of in the backdrop. And it kind of just struck me that as we're stepping into this Christmas season, that the why Jesus showed up, why Jesus came as a baby in the manger was always the cross. And his sacrifice for us. And so, why did God become a man? It was so that we could know him. And the way that we could know him was through Jesus' sacrifice.
And so as John wants to describe this to us, as he thinks of the gospel, it's interesting. He starts his gospel differently than the other 3 gentlemen, in that he goes all the way back to the beginning. He uses this code name for Jesus, the word, logos. And he says that the word was with God in the beginning, and that the word was God, that he was a member of the Trinity, the triune God, one God in 3 persons, and that he was the creator of all things. Well, that reminds me of going back to Genesis 1, where it also talks about in the beginning. John starts his gospel the same way the book of Genesis begins, in the beginning. And that's when God created the heaven and the earth. And the first thing that God spoke was, "Let there be light." And it's interesting that here in John's gospel, we're told that Jesus, in him was life, and the light was the light of men, and the light shines in the darkness.
Well, and what's interesting about that Genesis account, not to get off on a creation wormhole, but he created light, and then he created the heavenly bodies, the sun, the moon, and the stars, like multiple days later.
Yeah. There's light, and then there's light, apparently.
Yes, there's light, big L, and light, little L, I think.
Yes.
It's not that he created Jesus there, but that the creation of light, that light existed outside of what we know as light producers. It's just kind of an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, it's the greatness and majesty of God, that there's light and then there's light. That's absolutely true.
John 1 reminds me of, we walked through Colossians a couple months ago, right? And in Colossians 1, where he's talking about the preeminence of Christ, he is the image of the invisible God, which we're speaking here, right? For by him all things were created. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Like, just that's what John 1 kind of reminds me of, that the in the beginning was the Word,
right,
was God.
And this idea of the Word was with God, that there was a fellowship among the Trinity here that is mind-blowing beyond what we can understand. But it helps you understand why back in the creation account in John 1:26, God said, let us make man in our image. He's speaking in the plural. Let us make God in our image, after our likeness, and let him have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heaven and over the livestock and over the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. That answers a lot of questions for us about gender and about the sanctity of human life, created in the image of God. But one of the reasons that God became a man is because he had placed his image within us. And that image had been marred, and he's coming to set that straight and to give us the opportunity, as you said, to know him, because we had forgotten him and run off without him.
Well, and it's just that we created the problem.
Right.
And so the only way for that problem to be justified from God's view was that we had to then pay the price. And so the only way for that to happen was for there to be a perfect one of us that then paid the price.
Right.
Made it right.
And
so we weren't going to do that on our own.
No. And this kind of gets us into why did God become a man? Why, what was the motive behind that? And I immediately thought of John 3:16, which says, for God so loved the world, he sent his only son. And so the motive behind all of this is his love for us. And I was reading in Jeremiah 33:3, is a verse that Dr. Kennedy, who was the founder of the ministry I worked with for 10 years, so I heard this a lot. His favorite verse was Jeremiah 33:3, that says, God has loved us with an everlasting love. And so actually that was one of his favorite verses. There was another Jeremiah verse that says, call unto me and I will show you great and mighty things which he loved. But this one is, if God loves us with an everlasting love, that means there's never been a moment. Think about this. There's never been a moment when God didn't love us.
Right.
Individually. There will never be a moment when he doesn't love us. He loves us with an everlasting love. And therefore, he had to come to rescue us. He had to come to earth. He had to become a man so that he could reconcile us to himself.
Well, and so, I look at it as there's two elements. You probably come up with more than 2 points as you look to deliver your message, but I think there's 2 points. Like one, he came to save us from death. We had chosen death on our own, right, is what we're discussing here, and that the way to save us from death was to sacrifice himself, to pay that price, to take on death, to conquer death. That's what the resurrection did, right? Was this victory over death. Where is your sting, right? Before Christ came, death had a sting, a pretty heavy sting. Yeah. That we'd be separated from God for all of eternity. Like that's death, not just the ending of your physical life, but the separation from God who is life for all of eternity. Like that's the sting. And so the only way to save us from that was for him to come and take that himself, right? To pay that price. The price had to be paid, and he paid it in full. But then him conquering death, coming back to life, takes me to my next point, that not only did he come to save us, he had to come and become a man to save us from death, because he was the only one that could do it.
Right.
We couldn't save us from death. Adam couldn't do it. Moses couldn't do it. Abraham couldn't do it. David couldn't do it. Samson and all his strength couldn't do it. Paul couldn't do it. You couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. Billy Graham couldn't do it, right? Like no one could do it. It had to be someone that could conquer sin and thus conquer death, right? But then that conquering, that coming back to life, he came not only to save us from death, but Jesus says it, I came so that you may have life. Like that's two different things. There's a saving from death, and then there's a having life, right? And so he came so that we could have life, and so that we could avoid being separated from God, but then so that we could be with God.
Even better than that. Yes,
and have life and have it abundantly. But then he knew that part of what Jesus coming and living on this earth is he was an example for us. He lived as a human being, totally dependent on God, right? And so he lived as an example to us so that we could see God. So back to that John 1 verse, right? That we might know God, that we could see God being executed in a human life. That makes sense.
Right.
We can see that perfectly. And Jesus said multiple times, if you don't know, look at me. I am God.
Yeah.
I'm the image of God.
You've seen the Father.
You've seen him. You get it here. And so now there's an example that we can wrap our heads around, right? Because we can't wrap our heads around God as an infinite being. You mentioned the Trinity. We can't, our brains don't have the capacity to do that, but we can understand mostly Jesus, right? Because he's walking, he's in physical, he's in a vessel that we can understand, a human body, a human life. He was born and he died, and we get that. And so we can look at his life now and understand what it means to depend on God. We can see how he executes a dependence on God, a relationship with God, being plugged in with God, how often he spent time with God, how he was obedient to God, right? We have an example. And so he said he came so that we could have life and have it abundantly. And it's through him and his sacrifice and our belief in that and our following of him that we get access to that. But then there's also that example there as well, that he chose us to come down, to be one of us, to save one of us, so that we could live with him
forever and ever. And so it's interesting how John connects that concept of life to the concept of light, because he says, in him was life, and the life was the light of men, and the light came to shine in the darkness. Just like in Genesis, let there be light, because there's a darkness within us. There's a darkness in our soul. The Bible calls it sin. And that darkness separates us from God. And so Jesus, who is the life of the world, is also the light of the world. He came to turn on the light to show us the darkness, but also to show us the way out of the darkness, which is through him. And so he offers us this life, but not everyone receives it. And he knows that. He knew that before he left heaven. Not everyone is going to receive this. In fact, they're going to reject it, and they're going to kill me. That's the sacrifice. And
which
so
needed to happen, as we talked in our communion episode, right?
It had
we
to
don't
happen.
Want to go. Yeah, we don't want to go back in time and save Jesus' life. No, that needed to happen.
Exactly, and it was amazing and appropriate for it to happen because of who he was and what he came to do. But through that, then he offers us this life in his name to all those who will receive him. That is, all those who will believe in his name. And it says here that he gives us the right to become the children of God. So he adopts us into the family. This idea of relationship is so important to him, that he would become a man so that we could be reconciled to him, so that we could have a relationship with him, so that we could know the light of his love and live that out to its fullness, both now and forever. So he came because of his intent for us. His motivation was his great love for us. Because we were his image bearers, he created us to reflect his glory. And then, as you've said, he came to identify with us. He came to abide with us. The word became flesh and he dwelt among us. That word dwelt means he made his home here. He tabernacled with us. This was his home. And he came so that we could be at home with him. He came to show us the glory of God. He came to show us the grace of God. Moses came and gave us the law so that we could see that we were lawbreakers. And then Jesus came with grace and mercy and truth. And he's the perfect balance of grace and truth. And now sometimes those words seem like they're opposites. If I am only focused on the truth, then I am focusing, I can very easily move that into legalism, and you have to follow all these rules in order to get to God. If I focus too far on grace, I can become lenient and develop a license to sin. Well, I can just sin and God will forgive me because he's a gracious God. And so, but Jesus came to perfectly balance grace and truth so that we could understand how it would be possible that we could be set free by the truth, and how we could experience his grace perfectly, as well as his justice, his truth, in his reconciliation.
And he showed that by choosing us. Like one of my I've got a couple of favorite words, and one of them is Emmanuel. And it's not just a December word. Like I think of that word often throughout the year, because the angel said, and when Gabriel was talking to Mary, and he said, well, there's a verse that said, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. Like Jesus showing up at Christmas was God with us. It was God coming to be one of us, to be with us physically on this earth, so that, again, because of what he was going to do 33 years later on the cross, his sacrifice, so that we could be with him forever, right? And so just this idea of Emmanuel, which means God with us. And so that's what God created us to be with him. And then Jesus came so that he could remedy that separation that we created between them. So ultimately he wants to be with us. And Emmanuel means God with us, that was God showing up to become us so that we could be with him. And I just love that. I love that word, and thinking about that throughout the year, that God's with us, because now as a result of that, God, like Jesus is with me, like he's with me, so I can have him with me, in me, right? And so this is ultimate with us, like in us. Whereas Jesus walked among us, now we have the Spirit in us. And Jesus himself said that's better. As he was talking to the disciples, he said, I've got to leave so that something better can come, so that I can move from just being with you to being in you. And that wouldn't have happened, couldn't have happened without him becoming one of us. And we know that he gets what we're going through. Jesus lived 33 years on this life and went through pain and struggle, so that when future apostles tell us to take joy in suffering, that's what Christ did. And they point to him, they said that he went to the cross for the joy that was set before him. Like the ultimate suffering of dying, he saw the joy through it. And so he lived that out as an example for us, so that we can do the same thing in our life. And that's how we live an abundant life, is by depending on him and letting him live through us, his life that protrudes in through us. That's why.
Yeah, that's why. It's a big why. And so we're going to, for the next few weeks, we're just going to walk through some of the why questions associated with Christmas. Again, I would commend Dr. Jeremiah's book, Why the Nativity, because he looks at 25 of these questions. We're just going to look at a few of them and think together about them. And hopefully it'll help people settle in for a new, fresh look at Christmas as they go through these questions with us. So
instead of Googling it,
Bible it. That's right. Why did God become a man? He did that for you, my friends, because he loves you, because he wants a relationship with you. He wants you to experience life both now and forever. I encourage you to surrender yourself to him this Christmas season. Experience the reality of Emmanuel, God with us, who is also for us and can be in us when we invite him to be our Savior and our Lord and our Master. So, Merry Christmas, part 1. Why did God become a man? God bless you.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.